Well, I don't think that was me, but welcome. Sometimes I have that effect on people, it would seem. At least you're not going to fall asleep. I do think it's helpful for me to note that I may not be all that charismatic in my appearance, but I do take sleepiness in my talks as a sign of demon possession. So being that it's a Sunday morning and it's nice and rainy outside, if the person next to you start falling asleep, make sure that you lean very vigorously and cast out that demon of slumber, and we'll all get through together. Well, I'm really excited to be able to talk to you this morning on the theme of why I'm not an atheist. It's largely a responsive title. I think it was 1927 when then the famed atheist Bertrand Russell penned a very, very famous little leaflet that did the rounds through the academy called Why I Am Not a Christian. And so some 91 years on now, this is a little bit of my response, because the state of play between what he understood as a philosopher at the time to what we now have as the evidence and understanding in our hands is actually quite different. The philosophy, the science, even our understanding of the history of the text of the Bible has grown tremendously in the last 90 or so years. And so what I want to give you this morning is somewhat of my response to what would be the current climate in a secularized Australia that seems to present the thesis that if you're an educated, an intelligent, relatively normal person, well then the obvious way you should make sense of life is through a secular lens, to make reference without God anywhere in the picture. And this is something that when you see an idea being taken up in culture, it's always a very helpful thing to trace back the origins of ideas, not because it proves or disproves it, but simply to get an understanding of how our culture has arrived here at this present moment. It was about a century, a bit more now, where the famed philosopher and atheist Friedrich Nietzsche sent philosophical shockwaves around the world when he declared, God is dead. You see, to Nietzsche, then in a paganizing Europe, a secularizing Europe, the idea of God didn't really hold much sway. It was something that the arguments, the ideas, the evidence, it seemed to be very thin. And his belief was that God was just a useful concept that people had in the past, but it's something now as a society we've moved on from. We don't need God to explain things anymore. And he wasn't the first to think this. In fact, he was heavily influenced by a couple of other significant minds in and around the time. The first was a man named Ludwig Feuerbach. You may not have heard of him, but he has an epic beard that would rival most coffee-making baristas today. It's a hipster beard, and it's fantastic. But Ludwig Feuerbach wrote a fantastic book called The End of Christianity, and in there, his central thesis is that humans created a God in their own image. That at some point in the past, in our psychological evolutionary development, that we needed some kind of God to fill deep-seated psychological needs that we had, and so we thought upwards to create a figure up there. In fact, one of his colleagues, someone we might be more familiar with, Sigmund Freud, father of the psychoanalytic tradition, he argued more that this isn't just some abstract idea, but that what humans invented was some kind of sky daddy up there looking out after us. And he said, think about it this way. When you're a child growing up in the world, you draw tremendous comfort and identity and security knowing that there's a mum and a dad who love you and watch over you. But as you become an adult, all of a sudden those things are removed. And so it's beautifully helpful if you now have this sky daddy up there who knows everything that you do and is caring over everything that happens, and it's a comforting psychological need. In other words, belief in God is a crutch, something that people need to be able to make it through life, but not something that you believe on the basis of reason or rationality. And if you fast forward to today, the same kind of psychological critiques of the Christian faith come thick and fast. Richard Dawkins, the sort of high priest of new atheism, is famous for his critiques of religion and particularly of Christianity. And his idea is that Christians believe on blind faith. That faith, being belief in the absence of evidence, is what he calls the principal vice or the thing that's wrong with any religion. Or, to put it more popularly, now the famed Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking said it this way, that religion is just a fairy story for those afraid of the dark. Now, the challenge with this sort of psychological critique, that you only believe in God because you want to believe, that it makes you feel good, or it gives you hope, or it gives you comfort, is that that same psychological sword, it cuts both ways. One of my own professors when I was studying science and religion at Oxford was Professor John Lennox, a pure mathematician, a philosopher of science. And in response to this line, which was quoted by Hawking in the UK newspaper The Guardian, he wrote in his own op-ed piece where he responded that atheism is just a fairy story for those afraid of the light. Because if you're going to argue that you only believe in God because you want God to exist, then you could also argue the opposite, that you only disbelieve in God because you don't want God to exist. And what this conversation ignores is any exploration of the relevant evidence as to why we should believe something. Because it's a lie to say that Christianity is built on blind faith. Faith in and itself is something that human beings do every day. Right now, I have faith that my wife isn't cheating on me. Now, it's not blind faith. I know her character. I know how she's acted and supported me. I know where she is, at least where she claims to be with our boys. Because of what I know about her, I trust her. I believe in her. I have faith that right now, even though I don't have a drone hanging over her head watching her with a GoPro camera, or I haven't employed a private detective to be following her around or to be diving through her SMS, I don't need to do all of that because I know enough about her to be able to trust her. And Christian faith is built on the same thing. In John 20:31, the writer of John's Gospel says that these things I have written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing have life in his name. He gives reasons, arguments, and evidence as to why you think Jesus is who he claimed to be, so that your faith, it's not built on shifting sands. It's built on something solid, something that's able to withstand the storms of doubt and objections and of your own personal experiences. And so what I want to do this morning is explore a few ways or answers as to the question why I am not an atheist. And as a window perhaps into the modern claim of what atheism tends to offer, I'm going to use a 2008 London bus campaign that was sponsored by the Secular Humanist Association as well as Richard Dawkins himself. And according to this more humble statement of atheism, there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. And to me, the two reasons why I reject atheism in favor of the Christian story of Jesus is basically wrapped up in this slogan. The first is that I'm just not convinced that atheism is a better explanation of the evidence. So that when the slogan writers say there's probably no God, I'm not sure what justifies that statement as an informed academic claim. I said before that the state of things has moved on from the time of Bertrand Russell in the last 100 years, and nowhere is that more true than in the realm of science itself. You see, when Bertrand Russell was making the claim of his argument for why he's not a Christian, well, his own belief about the universe that we now inhabit was that the universe itself is eternal, that it's always been here. He spoke about the universe as being a brute fact. And this was something that was very popular amongst atheistic philosophers and scientists. Why? Well, if you say that our universe has a beginning, that time, space, matter, and energy come into existence out of nothing, well, then you need to be able to provide some kind of explanation for that beginning, some kind of cause. And as some within the academy at Oxford were saying, even up into the 1960s, they were concerned that that let too much of a defined foot in the door. Because for thousands of years, against every other major belief system, the Hebrews and the Christians have been claiming one very unusual point. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Every other ancient worldview spoke about an eternal universe of matter and energy, but that the Hebrews claim, no. The only eternal one is an immaterial spiritual mind who brought our cosmos, time, space, matter, and energy into existence out of nothing. And this was a claim that was remarkably proved to be true with Albert Einstein, special theory of relativity, with Edward Hubble, discovering the red shift in the planetary bodies as we're observing them, the idea that our universe is expanding outwards. A Catholic monk like George Lemaitre able to then map how this expansion works, allowing us to trace it back to a point in the finite past, an absolute beginning for our universe. And what scientists have gone on to discover about this beginning is fascinating. In science, they've come up with what they call the fine-tuning problem. There's cosmologists, one who's an Australian-based thinker. He's doing his postdoc research right now at the University of Sydney, a guy named Luke Barnes. He co-authored a book called A Fortunate Universe. He's a Christian, and yet his co-author is an atheist. And on the science of origins, they agree together that at the beginning moments of our universe, that there were some 50 or so constants and quantities. Think of like fundamental values that are hardwired into our universe that allow it to be capable of sustaining life anywhere in the vast reaches of this cosmos. Maybe picture it this way. There's this old school bank vault door for you that used to have to go into the bank to get money, right? Old school bank vault door, big steel thick door, big locking rods as a mechanism. And the only way you can get into the vault of life is if you have all 50 of these individual dials on the front of that door so finely calibrated to within tiny parameters. Couldn't turn it a little bit to the left or to the right, perfectly calibrated for that locking mechanism to open and life to be able to exist. Let me give you just one example. Scientists will tell us that the thing called the strong nuclear force, think of it as what stops an atom from going nuclear. It binds the parts of an atom together. They'll tell you that were you to alter the strong nuclear force by any more than 1 in 10 to the 37th power in either direction, that's 10 with 37 zeros after it, then the universe as we know it would never be capable of sustaining life. Now the question is, does something like that happen by chance? Are we just that lucky? Or is this evidence of design, of intelligence? Because the Bible in Psalm 19:1 claims that the heavens declare the glory of God and that the skies proclaim the work of his hands. In Romans 1:20, the Apostle Paul argues that since the creation of this world, God's invisible qualities, his divine power and might, have been clearly seen, being evidenced by what has been made, so that men are without excuse. The Bible claims that whether you look through a microscope or a telescope, you will find signals of God's intelligent design in this cosmos, that nature points upwards in worship towards its creator. And this precisely, I think, is what's happening here in fine-tuning. Just to get the magnitude of that number, 1 in 10 to the 37th power, there's an American physicist by the name of Hugh Ross. He gives this image. He says, imagine if you took the entire continent of North America. Okay, that includes all of the United States, where Donald Trump is. It includes Mexico, where Donald Trump doesn't want to go. And it also includes Canada, who hope Donald Trump will never visit. All of North America. And he says, cover it in 10-cent pieces. And then using a lot of sticky glue to avoid the problem of zero gravity, stack it up all the way to the moon, some 380,000 kilometers away at its biggest elliptical point. That is a lot of 10-cent pieces. Are we agreed on this? Now he says, take 1 billion continents as big as North America and repeat the process. Cover it in 10-cent pieces and stack it up to the moon. And then take one more 10-cent piece, dip it in red paint, hide it somewhere in the 1 billion and one stacks, blindfold the person who dragged you along this morning, kick them out into the wilderness, and let them choose at random just one coin from these stacks. The odds of them choosing that red coin is roughly speaking 1 in 10 to the 37th power. And we're speaking about the chance of just this one constant, the strong nuclear force, being so finely tuned. And when you calculate improbability on top of improbability on top of improbability, the numbers become quite literally incalculable, which has led many in the scientific community to be incredibly puzzled by this fine-tuning problem. One British astrophysicist, Sir Fred Hoyle, he's not a Christian, he's a skeptic, an atheist, and yet this is what he said in response to the evidence, and I quote. He says that the evidence here suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with chemistry and biology, so that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. He said that's what the common sense interpretation of this evidence would look like. And that is as close as you will ever hear an atheist, scientist, declaring Psalm 19:1, that the heavens declare the glory of God and that the skies proclaim the work of his hands. I think nature and our scientific discoveries powerfully points towards an intelligent mind behind it, reason to believe in favor of God over atheism. But that just gets us to somewhat of a belief in God, not yet a belief in Jesus. And over the last 100 years, there have also been huge advancements in our understanding of the textual history of the Bible and our knowledge of the first century and of other ancient accounts when it comes to the so-called resurrection of Jesus. See, for Christians, 1 Corinthians 15 says that all of what you believe hinges on whether Jesus of Nazareth was really crucified and then really supernaturally rose from the dead. Because if he's still in the grave, then your faith is futile, you're still in your sins. Those who have fallen asleep, dead, those who have died believing in Jesus, they're lost, and that Christians should be pitied above all people because they believe in a false hope. You're all idiots, is Apostle Paul's claim, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. But many people in our culture tend to think that the claim of Easter, that we believe in the original walking dead, some zombie Jesus, they think this is just faith talk, blind faith, without having any clue to the fact that there is a strong historical case that is made for the resurrection of Jesus. You see, although we can't prove a miracle from history, we can certainly prove a number of historical facts that are best explained by the miracle of Jesus' resurrection. And beyond reasonable doubt, I could give you a list of some 5 or so what we would call minimal facts, things that skeptical and atheistic ancient historians and Bible scholars will agree on is the best explanation of the data. Things like that Jesus really did die under sentence of Pontius Pilate by crucifixion, that the well-known tomb in which Jesus was buried became empty and was discovered by a bunch of Jesus' women followers on Easter Sunday, that after his resurrection, supposed resurrection, that many of Jesus' disciples genuinely believed that they saw him alive and were catapulted into a transformation on the basis of that encounter. Also, some skeptics like Thomas or Jesus' own family, James and Jude, who didn't believe in him prior to his death and resurrection, also were catapulted into believing in Jesus after what they claimed to have been a resurrection appearance of Jesus. And even that enemies of the gospel, people like Saul of Tarsus, sworn persecutors of the early Christians, also were catapulted to belief in Jesus after what he claimed again and again was a resurrection appearance of Jesus, that he saw him again alive, risen from the dead. Now, these 5 facts are something that are nearly incontrovertible from the historical weight of evidence that we have. And the only question is, how do you explain them? And some in history were not wanting to accept the Christian explanation that God raised Jesus from the dead. Instead have opted for things like a conspiracy theory, that the disciples just stole the body away and then they made up the story that Jesus was resurrected. Or offer theories like the hallucination theory, that Jesus really stayed dead, but that the disciples just had a psychological break with reality and they all dreamed up that they saw Jesus. Now, not only can these things not be sustained, they don't actually explain all of the relevant facts. It couldn't even explain, when it comes to the hallucination theory, a marijuana plantation in the background won't give you that kind of hallucination. Why? Because by nature, hallucinations aren't shared experiences. They're private mental events. You could have 500 people high at the same time, all hallucinating different things, but they won't all hallucinate the facts that we get in the Gospels of Jesus of Nazareth appearing to various people, individuals and groups, over a period of 40 days in situations where he ate with them, was embraced by them, was touched by them, and taught them openly from the scriptures. So when it comes to the historical data, the secular explanations, the non-supernatural explanations, they all fall short, so that even one of my own skeptical friends, he's an agnostic New Testament scholar, says, I don't know what happened. We can't explain what happened. Obviously something remarkable happened, to which I said, why not a resurrection? You see, the resurrection of Jesus is something that we can argue for historically in that it makes the best sense of all of the relevant data at hand. And these just being 2 of some 30 or so arguments for the existence of God and for the truth of Christianity, given the weight of evidence, I just don't know how you can make that statement that there's probably no God. It doesn't seem to me to be an honest investigation of the available data. But the second reason why I am not an atheist wrapped up in this slogan is that I don't think atheism is meaningful in being able to address life's deepest questions. What is it by the non-existence of God that allows you to say, now stop worrying and enjoy your life? Because what hope does atheism offer? What fears is it apparently waylaying to get rid of God's existence? How does it make life more enjoyable when you reduce us from having us as beings made in the image of God, to love Him and love others, and to serve the world? Instead now to just becoming animal-like creatures further along an evolutionary spectrum who can just do whatever you want to make you happy. It's a lesser view of life. See, in the last century, there was a famous anthropologist by the name of Loren Eiseley. This is one of those guys that you wish you didn't meet because they just make you feel deeply inadequate about your own success in life. He was someone that was so well renowned in his field that he received 36 honorary degrees in his life. I'm pretty sure that is more degrees than is on my child's thermometer. And yet, as another atheist, as a skeptic, but as someone who surveyed human cultures alive and dead, here's one of the most fascinating observations that he made. He said that man is the cosmic orphan. He is the only creature in the universe who asks, why? Other animals have instincts to guide them, but man has learned to ask questions. Who am I? Man asks. Why am I here? And where am I going? You see, according to Eiseley, irrespective of your belief system, these are the inescapable questions of life that every single person needs to answer. And how is it then that the atheist story answers these questions? Well, in one of his books, The River Out of Eden, Richard Dawkins gives us a summary statement of the atheist story, of the universe that we inhabit, when he said that the universe we observe has precisely the properties that you would expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And he's an optimistic atheist. You don't want to read Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, if this is the summary, then what does this have to say to those deep questions that Loren Eiseley answered? What does one gain by becoming an atheist in being able to make sense of our human experience? Now, I remember speaking to some of my friends who are skeptics and atheists, and they'll say things like, well, Dan, becoming an atheist means I'm a free thinker. I'm not bound by the religious dogmas and the things that you have to believe. I'm a free thinker. I'm a free intellectual. But if atheism is true, it's very hard to see how you can sustain that kind of claim. And follow me here, it's a bit more complex. If atheism is true, then the physical material world is all that there is. There is no immaterial world, there is no supernatural world. And so everything about who you are can be explained using physics, chemistry, and biology. You can all boil it down to the natural laws. Even the thoughts that you're thinking in your brain right now, that this is the most boring message you've ever listened to. That thought itself is predetermined by the laws of nature. Why? Because everything that happens in your brain is just chemicals fizzing, neurochemical reactions, DNA responding to stimuli, so that you are not truly free. You are predetermined by a material world. Many of the famous atheists, like Sam Harris, in his book on free will, he denies that free will is a real thing. Should I get the cheeseburger or the Big Mac? That's not a real choice. You only feel like you have a choice, but the outcome of that decision is predetermined by the laws of physics. You're not really free. Or someone like Daniel Dennett, more of a philosopher of mind, trying to deal with this mind-brain problem. When it comes to the question of consciousness, the sense of me, of I, that you're driving what's happening in your own life, he says that that's just an illusion. Your brain is driving you. You're in the passenger seat or in the boot. Or as Dawkins puts it, we're just dancing to our DNA. So if this is true, it's very hard to understand how we can sustain that idea that we're free thinkers, following the evidence to a particular conclusion, because if atheism is true, it seems to be that you're believing whatever your brain tells you to believe, and you have no control over that whatsoever. Rationality is dead in the water. Or some of my atheist friends on another score will say, well, at least we are free to be able to love who we want or to define morality on our own terms. But what is emotion or what is ethics on this kind of score? Now, if we reduce ourselves in the atheist story to just being physical creatures, then the ideal of what we have as love, something that comes from the very nature of God, again, is just a biochemical reaction to be able to further survival of the species. Why are you attracted to a certain young lady? That's a physiological reaction. It's a brain thing. You can't control it. Love is blind. And think about what atheistic poetry would look like, or a pickup line. You meet a girl at a bar, or hopefully at church. But given what I'm about to say, let's say a bar. And you walk up to her, and rather than trying to woo her with Shakespeare instead, you just say something like this, that I am biologically stirred to propagate our species with you. How do you think that kind of a pickup line is going to go? You see, when it comes to the world of ethics, Richard Dawkins says it plainly, the universe we inhabit is amoral. There is no ultimate good and evil. So whatever morality we have, whatever view of love, it has to be made up, imported, either by the individual person or by a collective, a social grouping, a nation, or a society. But on that score, there's no ultimate right or wrong. Why is love better than hate? It's just an individual preference, a personal aesthetic, a taste thing. Who decides whether it's better to love your neighbor or kill your neighbor? Who's the arbiter to say whether our onward march of history is one of moral progress or regress? Nietzsche picked it up. If God is dead, there is now no more up, down, backwards, forwards. The world has been unchained from its sun. It's become colder. Everything is just a power play. And the strong, or at least the loudest minority, control what everyone else ultimately thinks and pushes it upon us. But that's not how we experience life. We experience life as though good and evil are real things. We experience life as though our choices are real things, and that the consequences of those choices are something that often we bear within ourselves. And I think a much richer explanation than the atheist story for our own human life is the one that comes to us in Scripture. That we're made in the image of an eternal mind and a loving community of Father, Son, and Spirit. And that same freedom of rationality, that same goodness at the heart of who God is and longing to be in relationship to be loved is something that now plays out at the human level. I think the biblical story sheds so much more light on who we are as human beings. Yes, physical and animal-like, but also divine in nature. And perhaps Blaise Pascal, the famous skeptic turned Christian, the French mathematician of the 17th century, he said it well, that human beings are like deposed royalty. There is an incredible capacity that we have being made in God's image for love and goodness, for rationality, for creativity, for uncovering the secrets of the universe. But we've also been deposed. There is a fall. There is a diabolical aspect to our nature, a corruptedness, where the seeds of evil have their wrap around all of our hearts. And this is why, after his own conversion to Christianity, from being a hardened atheist in the academy to then encountering Jesus, that C.S. Lewis, the famous Oxford Don, the author of the Narnia Chronicles, he had this fascinating statement that he wrote in a wartime essay, where he said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. Not just because I see it directly, but because by it now I can see everything else. See, his thought was that if atheism is true, then that's a thin understanding of what it means to be human. It flattens us down just to a biological and psychological explanation. But there is a thick view of human life that is infused with meaning and purpose, with ethics and aesthetics, with love, and that this is something that comes to us by God's hand. And having become a Christian, his view was just, man, this makes so much more sense of what I see in our human experience, of that mixedness within the human heart, that it just brought so much explanatory power to life. So I'm not an atheist because I don't think it makes the most sense of reality when it comes to the evidence. And I'm not an atheist because I don't think it makes the most sense of our human experience in everyday life, of who we are and what goes on in here. But the other reason I'm not an atheist is because it does absolutely nothing for us when it comes to the theme of hope. I want to share a contrast. Oscar Wilde, again, perhaps just over a century ago, was a famous writer. If you go and read his writings, he sort of epitomizes the pursuit of sensuality. This guy said no to nothing that he wanted. He was the ultimate hedonist. I'm going to chase down every deep desire that I have and trying to live that out. And he pursued that particularly in the sexual arena. Now, what's fascinating about Oscar Wilde's life is he ended up dying alone of syphilis in his hotel room. And towards the end of his life, he penned what I cannot help but think is somewhat of an autobiographical story, one of his most famous ones called The Picture of Dorian Gray. And in this story, Dorian Gray is this young man, he's beautiful looking, would be on The Bachelor if he lived today. And Dorian Gray is given this portrait of himself, which becomes bewitched by dark magic. And the arrangement goes this way, that whatever Dorian Gray does in life, all of the consequences, rather than coming to him, they go to the painting. If he goes out and sleeps with 1 million people and gets STIs, then his body doesn't get the STIs, the painting bears the scars. If he lives for 10, 20, 50 years, he doesn't age, the painting ages. And so the portrait becomes a very visible reminder of the brokenness from within his own soul and the darkness and the scars that he carries. After a little while, he can't stand to look at the painting, so he hides it in the upstairs attic, and then he continues to try and find ultimate satisfaction, ultimate happiness in pursuing sexual pleasure, only to be wearied by that. He realizes it's empty. It's a good thing, but it can't be a God thing. It can't fill that deep longing for ultimate satisfaction. And so eventually he's wandering around the attic and he discovers the painting, and he is mortified by the decrepit image that he sees left there, a skeleton of the former humanity that he was designed to be. And in this moment of emotional outbreak, he takes a knife and he slashes the painting. And that single act reverses the magic. The painting is restored to its original picture, and all of the scars for the things done behind closed doors are all visited on his own body. And Dorian Gray dies there alone again in the attic of his own wounding with a knife in the chest. What do the atheist and Christian stories say to Dorian Gray? What does Dawkins and Jesus say to Oscar Wilde? There's probably no God, so don't worry and enjoy your life. But what happens in the pursuit of trying to enjoy your life, that your life has now become filled up with scars? You've made a bunch of mistakes. You've lived out of line with the way for which you were designed, and you bear the consequences, whether in your soul or in your mind or in your body. There's no hope on offer. There's no redemption. There's no eternal forgiveness. But when Jesus comes to speak into our brokenness, he offers to become what Oscar Wilde was searching for, an eternal portrait. Something that could take upon the scars, the darkness, the evil, the brokenness that he brought upon himself so that he doesn't have to bear that. Because what Jesus does when he comes to earth is he doesn't throw us out. He doesn't criticize us for screwing up. He knows us to the depths, everything we've ever done, and yet he loves us to disguise. And when he goes to the cross, when he dies on our behalf, he embraces all of the evil, all of the brokenness, all of the shame, all of the guilt, all of the scars. And that these are scars that John's gospel, that the book of Revelation tell us that he bears for all eternity. Behold, I saw a lamb as though it had been slain. And Jesus appeared amongst them, and showing the signs of his crucifixion, the scars in his hands and in his feet, and the spear mark in his side, he proved that he'd been risen from the dead. Jesus becomes our eternal portrait. And for anyone here who's wondering, why should I become a Christian? I don't just want you to become a Christian because it's true, even though it is. I don't just want you to become a Christian because it makes more sense and gives a better vision for human life, because it does. But I want you to become a Christian because by coming to Jesus, you receive forgiveness for all of the things that you've ever done. And you receive hope for a day when all of the physical scars, all of the psychological scars, all of the tears of this life will be wiped away by God's own hand. And the final pages of the Bible promise in Revelation 21:4 that there will be a place of no more suffering, sickness, crying, death, mourning, or pain anymore, for all of these things will pass away. And into God's eternal presence, into the heavenly arms of your eternal Father, you will be welcomed into never-ending joy, peace, goodness, love, the things that you were made for. And so the choice is yours. You can follow the evidence, follow the explanation, and follow the message of hope, but it ultimately leads to Jesus. And the only question you need to ask is, why am I not a Christian? What's actually holding me back? Why is it that perhaps I don't want God to exist? And whatever reason that is, whatever questions those are, I'm going to be here afterwards, and I'd love to sit down and talk through them with you. Let's bow our heads and let me pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you have not left yourself without testimony, but that you love every one of us so much that you have written your existence into nature. You've written it into our human heart. You've written it into the history of Jesus' resurrection, and that you've given it a profound hope that we too can find forgiveness and a new relationship with you and a thick life, one for which we were all created. And so, Lord, whatever is holding people back, whatever scars or hurts they carry, whatever objections or doubts cloud their mind, I pray that you would reveal yourself and respond to their challenges in a way that will allow them to embrace you, not with a blind faith, not with a leap into the dark, but a stepping into the light. I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. We thank you, Dan, for your message. Give him a clap. But it would be amiss of us not to have a time of response. And I'm thinking today that, look, for some people, you may have come in here and... So Mark chapter 9 talks about this guy who brings his child to be healed by Jesus. And he says, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. And so it's sort of like that. He's like, I know there's a God and I know there's something, but there's still something holding me back. And my prayer is that maybe something that Dan said has just given you one step closer. And so the question, why don't you believe? So we're going to have a time now that allows you to come and just come and kneel. And I'm going to invite some of our prayer team to come out the front. But we just want to actually allow God to move in our hearts. Or it might be today that you've carried those scars, like in that picture. And you thought, you know what, I've just got to wear these myself. And the good news for you today is that actually there's someone far greater. That God of the universe wants to actually take those scars. So we're going to have a moment now. And as the band plays, if you'd like to come and pray or have someone pray with you, one of the things we do here is we are a church that's all about renewing covenants. A covenant is like a spiritual bond that we make with God. And if God has stirred something in you today, and you'd like to renew a covenant, you'd like to say again, God, I want you to be the one who takes away my scars. I want you to be the one who helps me deal with that unbelief. God, today I want to afresh say that I trust you with my life. As the band plays, I invite you to come. You can be anointed with oil. You can renew this covenant. You can kneel or pray with one of our people. Let's minister to each other. In Jesus' name, amen.